In the skies above the Philippine Sea, roughly 100 miles from Guam's shores, a Japanese naval aviator experienced something that would shake the foundations of everything he believed about aerial warfare. Lieutenant Saburō Sakai, an accomplished pilot with 64 confirmed victories across 3 years of continuous fighting, watched an American fighter climb away from his formation with an ease that seemed to defy the natural order of combat he had come to understand. The date marked a turning point. June 19, 1944. Sakai commanded 9 fighters in the Mitsubishi A6M50, the most recent version of the aircraft that had dominated Pacific skies during the war's opening campaigns. His formation held position at 18,000 feet, tasked with intercepting enemy carrier aircraft approaching the Japanese fleet. The American plane initially appeared as a silhouette against the tropical sun, its profile nearly identical to Japanese fighters at first observation. Recognition came when it rolled into its attack dive. This was a Grumman F6F Hellcat, noticeably larger and heavier than the Zero, distinguished by its rounded fuselage and massive engine cowling that housed power Sakai knew far exceeded his own aircraft's capabilities. Rather than engaging immediately, the Hellcat pilot made an unexpected choice. The American began climbing, ascending rapidly, and pulling away from Sakai's formation with apparent effortlessness. Sakai advanced his throttle fully, hearing the familiar high-pitched whine of his Sakae engine as he initiated his own climb in pursuit. At 19,000 feet, his rate of ascent had noticeably decreased. By 20,000 feet, he could physically feel his engine laboring as the thin air at altitude deprived it of the oxygen necessary for full power generation. The Hellcat above continued climbing, seemingly unaffected, extending its lead with each passing moment. Sakai's altimeter registered 21,000 feet, then 22,000. His wingmen were falling behind, their aircraft struggling even more severely than his own. Upon reaching 23,000 feet, Sakai made a tactical decision that would have been inconceivable to him 2 years prior. He broke off the pursuit, rolled his Zero over, and dove back down to 15,000 feet, ordering his formation to follow. They would not chase American fighters above 20,000 feet. Instead, they would maintain position at medium altitude and hope the Americans descended to their level. This represented a fundamental shift from the warfare Saburō Sakai had been trained to conduct, far removed from the conflicts where Japanese naval aviators had dominated during 1941 and 42. This new form of aerial combat prioritized altitude superiority over maneuverability, where engine power trumped pilot skill, where Americans could simply climb beyond Japanese fighter capabilities and choose whether to engage on their terms. The question that would plague Japanese pilots for the war's remainder had already been answered in that moment of abandoned pursuit. What options exist when enemy aircraft can operate where yours cannot? When the core assumptions of training, tactics, and aircraft design become obsolete due to an engine producing nearly twice your own horsepower, the answer, as Sakai and thousands of other Japanese pilots would discover, demanded adaptation or death. It required changing tactics, abandoning the aggressive dogfighting doctrine that had served so effectively during the war's early years, and learning to fight a defensive campaign at altitudes where their aircraft could still perform adequately. It meant refusing combat above 15,000 feet, because above that threshold, they were not competing on equal terms. They were flying machines designed for a different conflict against an adversary who had solved problems they hadn't even recognized existed. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was not a design accident. It represented the deliberate product of Japanese naval aviation doctrine, refined through years of combat experience in China and careful study of European aerial warfare. The Imperial Japanese Navy began developing specifications for a new carrier-based fighter in 1937, seeking an aircraft to replace the aging A5M Claude. The requirements were demanding, perhaps impossibly ambitious. The Navy wanted a fighter capable of escorting bombers on long-range missions, requiring extended fuel capacity and economical engine performance. They wanted exceptional maneuverability to ensure victory in dogfights, necessitating lightweight construction and large control surfaces. They wanted heavy armament, including 2 20mm cannons, unusually powerful for a fighter of that era. And they wanted all this in an aircraft capable of operating from aircraft carriers, imposing strict limitations on size and weight. Jiro Horikoshi, Mitsubishi's chief designer, understood that meeting all these requirements simultaneously would require radical compromises. He chose to prioritize range and maneuverability above everything else. This meant stripping the aircraft of any unnecessary weight. The Zero had no armor protection for the pilot. It lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, the rubber-lined tanks that would automatically seal bullet holes and prevent fuel leaks. It had minimal structural reinforcement, using the lightest gauge aluminum that could maintain structural integrity. The result was an aircraft weighing just 3,540 pounds empty, remarkably light for a fighter of its size and capability. When fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, it weighed 5,313 pounds, still lighter than most contemporary fighters at their empty weight. The engine selected for the Zero was the Nakajima Sakae, a 14-cylinder, two-row radial engine producing 940 horsepower at takeoff and maintaining approximately 830 horsepower at 15,000 feet. This was not an impressive figure by international standards even in 1940, but it proved sufficient for the lightweight Zero. The aircraft's low weight meant its power-to-weight ratio was actually quite favorable, giving it excellent climb rate and acceleration at low to medium altitudes. The Sakai engine was reliable and fuel-efficient, critical factors for long-range operations over the Pacific's vast expanses. It could run for hours at economical cruise settings, giving the Zero an operational range that astonished Allied intelligence analysts when they first learned of it. A Zero could fly over 1,600 miles with its internal fuel plus drop tank, far exceeding the range of any American carrier fighter in 1941. Japanese naval aviation doctrine emphasized offensive operations and aggressive tactics. Pilots were trained to seek out enemy aircraft and destroy them through superior maneuverability and marksmanship. The ideal engagement, as taught at the Yokosuka Air Group training facility, began with a high-speed diving approach to gain energy and position, followed by transition into a turning fight where the Zero's exceptional maneuverability would allow the pilot to get onto the enemy's tail and deliver, killing fire with the 20mm cannons. Pilots practiced endless hours of aerobatic maneuvers, learning to push their aircraft to the limits of its performance envelope. They learned to perform the Immelmann turn, the split S, the barrel roll, and the high yo-yo, all the classic maneuvers of dogfighting. They learned to judge deflection angles for gunnery, to lead a target properly, to recognize the moment when an enemy pilot made a mistake that could be exploited. The training was rigorous and the standards were high. Only the best pilots graduated to operational squadrons. By 1941, Japan had accumulated a cadre of naval aviators who were, by any measure, among the most skilled and experienced fighter pilots in the world. Many had combat experience from China, where they had fought against Chinese and Soviet aircraft. They knew their aircraft intimately, understood its strengths and weaknesses, and had developed tactics that maximized its capabilities. When these pilots flew into combat in December 1941, attacking Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, they achieved a level of air superiority that shocked their opponents. American, British, and Dutch pilots found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by the Zero. The Japanese fighter could outturn anything the Allies flew. It could outclimb most opponents at low altitude. Its 20mm cannons were devastating when they hit, far more destructive than the rifle-caliber machine guns that armed most Allied fighters in the Pacific at that time. The victories came quickly and decisively. On December 8, 1941, Zero fighters escorting bombers to attack Clark Field in the Philippines destroyed dozens of American aircraft on the ground and shot down multiple P-40 Warhawks that attempted to intercept. On December 10th, Zeros provided escort for bombers attacking the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, helping to sink both capital ships and demonstrating that aircraft could dominate even the most powerful surface vessels when they lacked air cover. Throughout December and into January, Japanese naval aviators racked up impressive kill ratios. American pilots flying P-40 Warhawks and P-39 Airacobras found themselves at a severe disadvantage in turning fights. The Zero could simply outturn them, getting onto their tails and delivering fatal bursts of cannon fire before the American pilots could react. British pilots in Malaya and Singapore, flying obsolete aircraft like the Brewster Buffalo, fared even worse. The Buffalo was already considered inadequate in Europe, and against the Zero, it was hopelessly outmatched. Japanese pilots achieved kill ratios of 10-1, 15-1, even higher in some engagements. The psychological impact on Allied pilots was severe. They developed a healthy respect for the Zero that sometimes bordered on fear. Intelligence reports from early 1942 described the Japanese fighter as invincible, as a superweapon that Allied aircraft simply could not defeat in a fair fight. Some reports exaggerated the Zero's capabilities, crediting it with performance characteristics it did not actually possess. But the fundamental truth remained. In the hands of experienced pilots at low to medium altitude, in turning engagements, the Zero was the dominant fighter in the Pacific theater. Japanese pilots absorbed these victories and drew conclusions that seemed entirely reasonable at the time. Their training was superior, their tactics were sound, their aircraft, despite its light construction and lack of armor, was fundamentally the right design for naval aviation. The doctrine of aggressive offensive action, seeking out the enemy and destroying him through superior maneuverability, had been validated in combat. These conclusions would become articles of faith in the Japanese naval aviation community, beliefs so deeply held that they would be difficult to abandon, even when evidence began to accumulate that circumstances had changed. The Zero's dominance created institutional momentum, a conviction that the path Japan had chosen for fighter design and tactics was correct. When American aircraft appeared that could match or exceed the Zero's performance in certain regimes, Japanese response was often to double down on existing doctrine rather than fundamentally reconsider their approach. This was not stupidity or blind adherence to tradition. It was a rational response based on extensive combat experience. The Zero had worked magnificently against every opponent Japan had faced from 1937 through 1942. Chinese fighters, Soviet fighters in the border conflicts, American P-40s, British Buffaloes, Dutch aircraft, all had been defeated, often decisively. Why would Japan abandon a winning formula? The answer, which would become apparent only gradually over 1943 and explosively clear in 1944, was that the Americans were not simply building better versions of the fighters Japan had already defeated. They were building fighters designed according to fundamentally different principles, fighters that would make altitude performance and engine power the decisive factors in aerial combat, and they were building them in quantities that would overwhelm Japanese production capacity by margins that seemed almost incomprehensible. The Americans were not supposed to build aircraft like the Hellcat. This was not hyperbole or propaganda. It was a genuine miscalculation embedded deep within Japanese strategic planning. Imperial Navy analysts had studied American industrial capacity extensively throughout the 1930s, examining factory output, production techniques, and design philosophy. They had concluded, quite logically based on available evidence, that American aircraft would prioritize comfort, durability, and ease of manufacturing over pure performance. American fighters would be heavier, sturdier, more forgiving to fly but ultimately slower and less maneuverable than their Japanese counterparts. This analysis proved accurate for early American designs. The Brewster Buffalo, the Grumman F4F Wildcat, even the P-40 Warhawk all followed this pattern. They were rugged machines that could absorb punishment and keep flying, but they could not outturn a Zero, could not match its climb rate at low altitude, could not chase it in a sustained dogfight. What Japanese analysts failed to anticipate was the American response to this tactical disadvantage. Rather than attempting to build a more maneuverable fighter to match the Zero turn for turn, American designers identified the Zero's fundamental weakness and designed an aircraft specifically to exploit it. The weakness was power. The Sakae engine's 940 horsepower was adequate for the Zero's lightweight airframe at sea level and medium altitudes, but it struggled in the thin air above 15,000 feet. Moreover, the Zero's design philosophy, prioritizing range and maneuverability by stripping away armor, self-sealing tanks, and structural reinforcement, meant that any increase in engine power would require compensating weight increases elsewhere in the airframe. You could not simply drop a more powerful engine into a Zero without extensive redesign. The aircraft's entire structure was optimized around the Sakae's power output and weight. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation approached the problem from the opposite direction. Their design team, led by William Schwendler and Leroy Grumman, began with the premise that engine power was the decisive factor in modern air combat. If you had sufficient power, you could accept weight penalties that would be prohibitive in a less powerful design. You could add armor protection for the pilot. You could install self-sealing fuel tanks that weighed significantly more than standard tanks. You could build in structural redundancy that would allow the aircraft to survive battle damage that would destroy lighter fighters. You could carry heavier armament, 650 caliber machine guns, instead of the rifle caliber weapons that armed many early warfighters. And if you had enough power, you could still achieve performance that matched or exceeded enemy fighters in the regimes that mattered most. Speed, climb rate at altitude, and dive performance. The engine they selected was the Pratt Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder two-row radial that produced approximately 1,900 horsepower at sea level and could maintain over 1,600 horsepower at 15,000 feet with water injection. In later variants designated R2800W, power output reached 2,200 horsepower at war emergency settings. This was not merely an incremental improvement over the Sakae. It was a categorical difference, a factor of more than 2 to 1 in power output. The Double Wasp weighed 2,360 pounds, nearly as much as the entire empty weight of a Zero's engine and much of its forward fuselage combined. But that weight brought capabilities that fundamentally altered aerial combat dynamics. The Hellcat that emerged from Grumman's factory in June 1942 weighed 9,238 pounds empty and 13,228 pounds fully loaded, more than twice the Zero's combat weight. Yet despite this enormous weight differential, the Hellcat could climb to 15,000 feet in 7 minutes and 6 seconds, matching the Zero's climb rate. Above 15,000 feet, the Hellcat's superiority became pronounced. At 20,000 feet, it maintained a climb rate of 2,180 feet per minute, while the Zero struggled to achieve 1,500 feet per minute. At 25,000 feet, the disparity widened further. The Hellcat could still climb at over 1,000 feet per minute. The Zero could barely maintain altitude while maneuvering. Maximum speed told a similar story. At sea level, the Zero was slightly faster, achieving approximately 331 miles per hour versus the Hellcat's 318. But at 15,000 feet, the Hellcat reached 376 miles per hour, while the Zero managed 346. At 25,000 feet, the gap widened to nearly 50 miles per hour in the Hellcat's favor. Dive speed was not even comparable. The Hellcat could dive at speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour without structural failure. The Zero's lighter construction limited safe dive speed to approximately 380 miles per hour, and pilots who exceeded this risked control surface failure or structural damage. The first Hellcats arrived at American carrier squadrons in January 1943, initially with VF-9 aboard USS Essex. Pilots transitioning from the Wildcat noticed the differences immediately. The aircraft felt heavy on the controls compared to earlier fighters, requiring more physical strength to maneuver in tight turns. But in exchange for this reduced agility, they gained capabilities that transformed their tactical options. They could choose when to engage. They could dive on Japanese formations from above, make high-speed firing passes, then climb back to altitude faster than pursuing Zeros could follow. If a fight turned unfavorable, they could simply dive away, using their superior dive speed to break contact. Japanese fighters could not follow into high-speed dives without risking structural failure. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, one of America's early fighter aces, flew early Hellcat variants and recognized immediately that the aircraft represented a fundamental shift in Pacific air combat. In debriefing reports from Marcus Island strikes in August 1943, he noted that Japanese fighters refused to engage Hellcats at high altitude, instead maintaining positions at 12 to 15,000 feet and hoping American fighters would descend to their altitude. When Hellcats remained at 20,000 feet or above, Japanese formations would often withdraw entirely, rather than accept combat at a disadvantage. This represented a complete inversion of the tactical situation that had prevailed in 1941 and 1942. American pilots who had spent 2 years learning to avoid turning fights with Zeros, to use their aircraft's superior diving speed and ruggedness to survive against more maneuverable opponents, now found themselves in the dominant position. They could dictate engagement terms. They could refuse combat at low altitude, where Zeros retained maneuverability advantage. They could attack from above with energy advantage, and the enormous power of the Double Wasp engine meant they could regain altitude quickly after diving attacks, ready to attack again, while Japanese fighters were still climbing back to fighting altitude. June 19th, 1944 became known to American forces as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a designation that captured both the lopsided nature of the air combat and the institutional confidence that had replaced the defensive caution of earlier years. To Japanese pilots who survived that day, it was simply called the disaster, a catastrophe so complete that some refused to discuss it even decades later. The battle occurred during the larger naval engagement known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where American carrier forces intercepted a Japanese fleet attempting to attack the American amphibious landings at Saipan. Vice Admiral Saburō Ozawa commanded the Japanese carrier force, operating 9 carriers with approximately 450 aircraft. His pilots were not the experienced aviators of 1941. Those men were largely dead, shot down over Guadalcanal, Rabaul, New Guinea, the Solomons in the grinding attrition battles of 1942 and 1943. The Japanese naval aviation training program could not replace losses at the rate they were occurring. Training time had been shortened. Standards had been lowered. Many pilots arriving at carrier squadrons in mid-1944 had less than 100 hours of flight time, compared to the 300 to 700 hours typical of pre-war graduates. They understood basic flight maneuvers and gunnery, but they lacked the instinctive aircraft control and situational awareness that came only with extensive practice. These pilots flew into combat against American carrier air groups that had been preparing specifically for this engagement for months. Task Force 58 under Admiral Mark Mitscher fielded 15 carriers with over 900 aircraft, nearly 2/3 of them Hellcats. American pilots had studied Japanese tactics extensively. They knew the Zero's capabilities and limitations. They knew to maintain altitude advantage, to avoid sustained turning fights, to use diving attacks that exploited the Hellcat's speed and structural strength. Most critically, they operated with complete confidence in their aircraft's performance superiority above 15,000 feet. The first Japanese strike wave launched at 8:30 in the morning, comprising 69 aircraft, 45 fighters, 16 Yokosuka D4Y dive bombers, and 8 Nakajima B6N torpedo bombers. American radar detected them at 150 miles range. Hellcat fighters launched from multiple carriers, climbing to 25,000 feet to intercept. The Americans held every advantage: altitude, numbers, aircraft performance, pilot experience, and radar-directed interception that allowed them to position optimally before visual contact. When the forces met approximately 40 miles from the American fleet, the result was slaughter. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu from VF-16, flying from USS Lexington, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes, all dive bombers that had become separated from their fighter escort. His gun camera footage, reviewed later, showed Japanese aircraft that barely attempted evasive maneuvers, pilots who seemed overwhelmed by the speed and aggression of American attacks. Commander Charles Brewer, leading VF-15 from USS Essex, positioned his division at 28,000 feet above a group of Japanese fighters at 19,000 feet. The Japanese never saw them until Hellcats were diving through their formation at 400 miles per hour, guns firing. By the time Japanese pilots reacted and attempted to turn into the attack, the Hellcats were already climbing back to altitude, using their power advantage to regain energy before the Zeros could pursue. The pattern repeated throughout the day. 4 separate Japanese strike waves attacked the American fleet. All 4 were intercepted by Hellcats operating at optimal altitude. Of approximately 373 Japanese aircraft that launched that day, 315 were destroyed. Most never reached the American fleet. They were shot down during the approach, torn apart by Hellcat formations that held every advantage. Warrant Officer Koshi Ito survived the first strike wave on June 19th. His account, recorded decades later for the Japan Center of Asian Historical Records, described the engagement with a clarity that spoke to traumatic memory permanently etched. He had launched from carrier Zuikaku with 8 other Zero pilots, tasked with escorting dive bombers to the American carrier force. At 22,000 feet, approximately 70 miles from the American fleet, his formation leader spotted American fighters above them, dark silhouettes at perhaps 28,000 feet, positioned with textbook tactical advantage. The leader ordered the formation to climb to meet them, standard doctrine for establishing parity before the enemy could dive. They climbed as hard as their engines would permit, full throttle, mixture rich, trying to gain altitude before the Americans attacked. But they barely climbed at all. The thin air, the altitude, their engines had no power. Ito watched his altitude gauge, saw it creep upward so slowly. 23,000 feet, 24,000. The American fighters above them seemed motionless, just waiting. Then they rolled over and dove. The Hellcats fell through the Japanese formation at speeds Ito estimated exceeded 400 miles per hour, far faster than any Zero could dive safely. The lead American fighter fired as it passed through, a 2-second burst that destroyed Ito's wingman's aircraft instantly. The Zero exploded, hit in the fuel tank by 50 caliber rounds that ignited the unprotected gasoline. Ito instinctively rolled into a hard turn. The defensive maneuver drilled into him during training, but the Americans did not follow into the turn. They continued diving below the Japanese formation, used their speed to extend away horizontally, then began climbing again. Ito watched them climb, watched them regain altitude faster than he was climbing in his pursuit, and understood with absolute clarity that he had no tactical answer to this situation. In that moment, he knew they could not win. Not this fight, not this battle, not this war. The Americans could attack whenever they chose from whatever position they preferred, and if the fight went badly, they could simply leave. The Japanese could not catch them. They could not force them to fight where their aircraft had advantage. The Americans decided everything. Japanese pilots who survived June 19th returned to their carriers with reports that confirmed what operational commanders had suspected, but not yet fully accepted. The tactical situation had fundamentally reversed from the early war period. Japanese fighters could no longer establish air superiority through superior maneuverability and aggressive tactics. American aircraft now held the decisive advantage in the performance characteristics that mattered most in modern air combat: power, speed, and altitude performance. The Zero's exceptional turning radius, the capability that had made it dominant in 1941 and 1942, had been rendered largely irrelevant by American fighters that refused to engage in turning fights. Vice Admiral Ozawa's after-action report to Combined, Fleet Headquarters acknowledged this reality with unusual bluntness. Their fighter aircraft could not compete with enemy carrier fighters above 5,000 meters altitude. Enemy formations maintained altitude advantage and attacked at their discretion. Japanese fighters attempting to pursue were unable to climb quickly enough to engage effectively. He recommended immediate development of higher performance fighter aircraft with engines producing minimum 1,800 horsepower. This recommendation went nowhere. Japan's aircraft engine industry could not produce engines approaching that power output in significant quantities. The most powerful Japanese production engine in mid-1944 was the Nakajima Homare, producing approximately 1,800 horsepower in optimal conditions. But it suffered chronic reliability problems and was available only in limited numbers. The industrial and technological gap had become unbridgeable. Japan's aviation industry in 1944 produced approximately 28,000 aircraft of all types. American production that same year exceeded 96,000 aircraft. The disparity in resources, manufacturing capacity, and technological sophistication meant that even if Japanese designers created superior fighters, they could not produce them in quantities sufficient to matter strategically. Lieutenant Saburō Sakai, the pilot who had broken off his pursuit above 23,000 feet in June 1944, survived the Philippine Sea battle. He survived despite flying 22 combat missions that month, despite engaging Hellcat formations on 13 separate occasions, despite losing 11 squadron mates to American fighters in the span of 3 weeks. His survival was not accidental. It resulted from immediate, ruthless adaptation of tactics in response to undeniable material reality. Sakae understood with the clarity that comes only from repeated near-death experiences that Japanese pilots could no longer fight the war they had been trained to fight. The tactical adaptations began informally, pilot to pilot, through conversations on carrier decks and at forward airfields. Stay below 15,000 feet. Maintain formation discipline. Isolated Zeros were easy prey for diving Hellcats. Never pursue American fighters upward. They wanted you to chase them into thin air where your engine lost power and their advantage multiplied. If jumped from above, roll into a hard descending turn immediately, using the Zero's superior roll rate and turning radius to complicate the American firing solution. Then dive for the deck. Maximum dive speed be damned. Structural failure was preferable to certain death from 50 caliber rounds. At low altitude, below 5,000 feet, the the Zero retained comparative advantages in maneuverability and climb rate, forced the fight down there, where American pilots might accept turning engagements, where the Hellcat's weight became a liability rather than an asset. These adaptations were codified into formal doctrine by August 1944. The Combined Fleet Air Staff issued revised fighter tactics manuals, acknowledging what frontline pilots already knew. The manual's language was carefully diplomatic, avoiding explicit statements that Japanese fighters were inferior, but the tactical recommendations made the reality clear. When enemy formations held altitude advantage of 2,000 meters or more, fighter units should maintain defensive posture at medium altitude and await more favorable engagement opportunities rather than accepting combat at extreme altitude disadvantage. This was bureaucratic language for, do not chase Hellcats above 20,000 feet because you will die. The psychological impact on Japanese pilot morale was profound and difficult to quantify, but it appeared repeatedly in captured diaries and post-war interviews. Pilots described feeling hunted rather than hunting, reactive rather than aggressive. The offensive spirit that had characterized Japanese naval aviation doctrine since the 1920s, the conviction that victory came through aggressive pursuit and destruction of the enemy, had been replaced by defensive caution born from survival necessity. This was not cowardice. Many Japanese pilots continued flying combat missions with extraordinary courage, knowing they were outmatched, but fighting regardless. But the psychological confidence that comes from knowing your aircraft is superior to the enemy's, that your training and tactics give you decisive advantage, had been shattered. Some pilots refused to adapt. They continued attempting to dogfight Hellcats at high altitude, trusting in their superior maneuverability and skill, believing that proper technique could overcome material disadvantage. These pilots died quickly. Squadron commanders learned to identify which newly arrived pilots would accept the new tactical reality and which would not. The latter were often assigned to less critical missions, or paired with experienced flight leaders, who could forcibly impose tactical discipline. Survival rates diverged sharply. Pilots who adapted their tactics to acknowledge the Hellcat's altitude superiority, who stayed low and refused to be drawn into unfavorable engagements, survived an average of 37 combat missions in the latter half of 1944. Pilots who continued attempting traditional aggressive tactics survived an average of 8 missions. The adaptation extended beyond individual tactics to operational planning. Japanese strike packages began launching with fighter escorts that significantly outnumbered the bombers they protected. Sometimes 2 fighters for every bomber, attempting to compensate through numbers for what they lacked in aircraft performance. This force ratio was unsustainable given Japan's declining aircraft production and pilot training capacity, but operational commanders had no better alternatives. You could not simply refuse to launch strikes because the tactical situation was unfavorable. The war continued regardless of whether Japanese aviation could compete effectively. By October 1944, when American forces invaded the Philippines, Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as a competitive fighting force. The statistics were brutally unambiguous. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement of the Pacific War, Japanese carriers served primarily as decoys, sacrificial bait to draw American carrier forces away from the main battle area. The carriers Zuikaku, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho sailed with a combined air group of approximately 108 aircraft, less than the air complement of 2 American fleet carriers. These aircraft launched on October 25th in what amounted to a suicide mission. 86 were destroyed. The pilots knew before launching that they were unlikely to return, that their primary mission objective was simply to draw American attention long enough for Japanese surface forces to attack the American landing fleet. The remaining Japanese naval aviators, those few hundred pilots still alive and operational by late October, understood they were participating in the final act of a lost campaign. Warrant Officer Ito, who had survived the Philippine Sea battle in June, flew his last mission on October 26th. He was assigned to escort a small strike group, attacking American carriers off Samar. His formation encountered a combat air patrol of 16 Hellcats at 18,000 feet. The Japanese formation was at 12,000 feet, and following revised tactical doctrine, they did not attempt to climb to engage. Instead, they tried to maintain their escort position and hoped the bombers could reach their targets before being intercepted. The Hellcats dove through the formation, shot down 3 Zeros in the initial pass. climbed back to altitude, and attacked again. Ito's fighter took multiple hits in the second attack, rounds that punctured his fuel tank and damaged his engine. He managed to ditch near a Japanese-held island and was eventually rescued by a submarine, but his combat career ended there. Post-war analysis revealed that the Hellcat achieved an air-to-air kill ratio against Japanese aircraft of approximately 19-1 across all Pacific operations from 1943 through 1945. This ratio was not primarily the result of superior American pilot skill, though American pilot training was generally more extensive by late war. It resulted from systematic material advantage, better aircraft, better radios for coordination, better radar for interception, better logistics for maintenance, better intelligence for tactical planning, and sufficient numbers to overwhelm Japanese defenses even when Japanese pilots flew tactically perfect missions. The Hellcat destroyed 5,156 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat while losing only 270 Hellcats to enemy fighters. No other aircraft in aviation history achieved comparable dominance. The Zero continued in production through August 1945, with approximately 10,500 total units manufactured across all variants. Later versions incorporated minor improvements, stronger wings for limited dive speed increases, slightly more powerful engines, better armament configurations. But these incremental changes could not address the fundamental design compromises that made the Zero competitive in 1941. You could not add 800 pounds of armor and self-sealing tanks without destroying the aircraft's range and climb performance. You could not install a 2,000 horsepower engine without completely redesigning the airframe structure. The Zero's design had been optimized for a specific set of performance requirements, and those requirements no longer match the tactical reality of Pacific air combat. Japan did develop advanced fighter designs in the war's final years. The Kawanishi N1KJ Shidenkai and the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden both featured powerful engines approaching 2,000 horsepower, armor protection, and performance characteristics that could theoretically compete with late-war American fighters. But production numbers remained minimal, with fewer than 1,500 Shidenkais completed before war's end. Manufacturing capacity, shortage of skilled labor, bombing of factory facilities, lack of raw materials, all the cascading effects of strategic defeat meant that superior designs could not reach operational squadrons in meaningful numbers. Saburō Sakai survived the war. He was one of approximately 300 Japanese naval aviators who flew combat missions in both December 1941 and August 1945, a survival rate of roughly 3% among pilots who had been operational at war's beginning. In his post-war memoir published in 1957, he devoted substantial space to the moment when he broke off pursuit of that climbing Hellcat in June 1944. In that instant, he understood that they had already lost the war, though it would take another 14 months for the final surrender. They had lost it not on the battlefield, but in the factories and engineering offices, where Americans had built engines they could not match and produced them in quantities they could not imagine. This acknowledgement appeared frequently in post-war Japanese analysis of the Pacific Air War. The Zero had been an excellent aircraft for the war Japan expected to fight in 1941, a war of rapid offensive operations where range and maneuverability allowed small numbers of highly trained pilots to achieve decisive local superiority. But the Americans had fought a different war, one where industrial capacity and technological development could overcome initial tactical disadvantages. The 2,200 horsepower Double Wasp engine that powered late-model Hellcats represented not just superior engineering, but an entire industrial and scientific infrastructure capable of solving complex metallurgical problems, producing high-octane aviation fuel in enormous quantities, manufacturing precision components at scale, and delivering these systems to combat zones across the vast Pacific theater. The comparison was stark. In 1944, Pratt Whitney produced approximately 28,000 Double Wasp engines across all variants. Japan's entire aircraft engine industry that year produced approximately 46,000 engines total across all types, most significantly less powerful than the Double Wasp. American engine production alone nearly matched Japanese total engine output, and American engines averaged substantially higher power output per unit. When you factored in superior fuel quality, better pilot training, more extensive maintenance support, and overwhelming numerical superiority, the tactical advantages compounded into strategic impossibility. The lesson, as absorbed by post-war air forces worldwide, was that tactical excellence could not compensate for fundamental material disadvantage beyond a certain threshold. A more maneuverable fighter flown by a more skilled pilot could defeat a less capable opponent in individual combat. But when the material disadvantage reached the level represented by the Zero Hellcat matchup, a 2-to-1 power differential that created insurmountable altitude and speed advantages, no amount of tactical adaptation sufficed. The pilot in the superior aircraft controlled engagement terms absolutely. He decided when to fight, where to fight, whether to fight at all. The pilot in the inferior aircraft could only react, survive if possible, and hope for circumstances that might temporarily neutralize his disadvantage. Modern fighter design absorbed this lesson completely. Contemporary air forces prioritize engine power, speed, and altitude performance over maneuverability in nearly all fighter specifications. The era of the turning dogfight, the aerial ballet that characterized early air combat, ended somewhere over the Philippine Sea in June 1944. It ended the moment Lieutenant Saburō Sakai, flying a Mitsubishi Zero at 23,000 feet, watched a Grumman Hellcat climb away from him with effortless superiority and understood that his Sakae, engine's 940 horsepower, could not pursue where that Double Wasp's 2,200 horsepower climbed. Easily, in that moment of broken pursuit, in that decision to roll over and dive back to lower altitude, rather than chase an enemy who operated in air too thin for his engine to breathe. The future of air combat revealed itself with absolute clarity. Power, not grace, would rule the sky. The transformation was not instantaneous across the entire theatre. Even as the Hellcat demonstrated its dominance in carrier operations, land-based air combat in various Pacific sectors continued to show mixed results through late 1943. The geography of the Pacific, with its vast distances and isolated island chains, meant that American air superiority developed unevenly, spreading gradually from the Central Pacific carriers toward the outlying combat zones. In the Southwest Pacific, where General Douglas MacArthur's forces fought their way up the New Guinea coast throughout 1943 and into 1944, Army Air Force pilots in P-38 Lightnings and later P-47 Thunderbolts faced Japanese Army Air Force fighters that, while similarly outmatched in power and altitude performance, operated from land bases with different tactical constraints than carrier-based Zeros. The Japanese Army's Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, known to the Allies as Oscar, shared many design philosophies with the Zero: lightweight, exceptional maneuverability, minimal armor, and relatively low-powered engines. Army pilots flying these aircraft faced the same fundamental problem their Navy counterparts encountered. American fighters could simply outclimb and outdive them, dictating engagement terms through superior power. But the land-based environment offered some tactical advantages unavailable to carrier pilots. Army fighters could operate from prepared airfields with better maintenance support, more consistent fuel quality, and the ability to position forces defensively around key objectives rather than projecting power across open ocean. These advantages proved insufficient to overcome the power differential, but they allowed Japanese Army air units to remain marginally more effective than their naval counterparts during the same period. The strategic implications extended far beyond individual combat encounters. The establishment of American air superiority throughout the Pacific theater fundamentally altered the nature of the naval war. Japanese surface forces, which had operated with at least local air parity during 1942, found themselves increasingly vulnerable to American air attacks by mid-1943. The loss of effective fighter cover meant that Japanese ships sailing within range of American carriers faced devastating airstrikes they could not adequately defend against. This forced the Japanese Navy into increasingly defensive postures, limiting offensive operations and eventually rendering much of their remaining surface fleet ineffective. The submarine war also felt the impact of air superiority shifts. American submarines operating in Japanese-controlled waters benefited enormously from the degradation of Japanese maritime patrol capabilities. Japanese flying boats and land-based patrol aircraft, which had posed significant threats to American submarines during the war's early phase, found themselves increasingly unable to operate effectively in contested airspace. Hellcats and other American fighters made it dangerous for Japanese patrol aircraft to conduct the persistent searches necessary for effective anti-submarine operations. This allowed American submarines to operate more freely, contributing to the devastation of Japanese merchant shipping that ultimately strangled Japan's war economy. The training pipeline disparity between the two nations created a cascading effect that accelerated Japanese decline. When experienced Japanese pilots were killed, replacing them with equally skilled aviators became progressively more difficult. The training program required fuel, aircraft, and time, all of which became increasingly scarce as the war turned against Japan. By contrast, American pilot training programs expanded throughout the war, operating far from combat zones in the continental United States where fuel was abundant, training aircraft were plentiful, and instructors could focus on thorough preparation without the pressure of immediate operational demands. American pilots arriving at combat squadrons in 1944 typically had over 300 hours of flight time, including extensive gunnery practice, formation flying, and simulated combat exercises. They understood basic fighter tactics before ever encountering an enemy. Many had flown the Hellcat or similar high-powered fighters during training, so the aircraft's handling characteristics were familiar when they reached operational squadrons. Japanese pilot training, by contrast, had deteriorated to the point where some pilots arrived at combat units with minimal formation experience and limited gunnery training. The fuel shortages afflicting Japan by 1944 meant that training flights were curtailed, with pilots receiving less flight time and fewer opportunities to practice complex maneuvers before being thrust into combat. The quality gap this created became starkly apparent in combat results. Experienced American pilots routinely shot down multiple Japanese aircraft in single engagements, not because of superior individual skill necessarily, but because they flew superior aircraft, operated with better tactical doctrine, and faced opponents who lacked the training necessary to maximize even their aircraft's limited advantages. The age of industrial air power had begun, and that transformation occurred at 23,000 feet over the Philippine Sea, when a Japanese pilot watched an American fighter climb beyond his reach and understood, with absolute clarity, that the war was already lost.